also applied in this building. And there are a couple of more innovations that we applied, all with the objective to reduce energy consumption and move for sustainable systems. Also, this building has its own wastewater supply. It's not connected to the sewer system. The building can be replaced. It could be put in another harbor also. So there are a couple of things that we try to make it flexible and sustainable. This is what it looks at night. So also really nice that you can do things with light and it has a different image. You can do all sort of fun games around the floating pavilion, water scooters, you name it. It's all possible. Now with the floating trees, maybe a little bit more challenging, but I think still possible. So there are all sorts of possibilities that this building brings that we didn't imagine when we were designing it. Another project that I worked on was the Harnespolder in Delft. It's the city where also my office is based, not too far from here. And this is a project of 6 floating houses. What's very innovative in this project is that the owners, the families, they became owner of a part of water. So they really became the legal owner of a water plot. That's already innovation in itself, not a technical innovation, but definitely innovation if it comes to zoning plans, legislation, and all these kind of things. Took a lot of time to fix that, but in the end it worked out. And it also brought some quite spectacular pictures. In this case, the floating house was built basically on the embankment, so on the land, and then it was put into the water. What's also very special about this building is that it has a new floating foundation system. It used a steel construction for the foundation, and this steel construction is cladded with high strength fiber materials to make it watertight. Basically similar as a boat. And because of that, it's a really, really light building. In this case, they even had to apply additional concrete to the building to drag down the buoyancy point and to make sure that it would not be too light and float away. Which is a kind of a luxury problem if you're involved in design of floating buildings. I also like very much the idea that citizens become project developers themselves. So nowadays, we can wait for professional project developers to make something and then buy it. But people are also very much motivated, not all people, but there are more and more people motivated to design their own house. And Olaf Janssen, the person you see here, did that. He made his own house. Here you see here, it was only a design yet. But he was so motivated that after he finished his house, he also started his own company. And he's now selling these houses all over the Netherlands. He just finished a project in Woerden. I think he's going to work on a project in Nijmegen as well. So you see, if you give citizens the opportunity to actually make something, that also new economic opportunities arise. So new companies, new possibilities. And that creates all sort of new, a whole space of new possibilities. So if you can design your own house, you might also be able to arrange your own energy supply and your own water supply. And this is a drawing we made a long time ago. If you create floating roads, you can put all sort of stuff in there. Membrane bioreactors, nanofiltration, you can treat your own wastewater, you can produce your own drinking water. So collectives of citizens, they can start making their own house, arranging their own water and energy supply, becoming much more independent also of the government, and creating much more a community than a very individualistic lifestyle that we nowadays have in modern society. What's nice, of course, if you would live here and you wouldn't like your neighbor, you can just move with your house to another place. So that's a possibility. Or say that you say, okay, this is a really nice place, but I don't like my house. You just sell your house, buy a new house, and put it at the same location. So you get much more possibilities, a much more dynamic urbanism, and we might even become nomads again, traveling with your floating house over the world and going to all sorts of different areas. I already showed you some examples of real projects, but all the building blocks for the Blue Revolution have already been developed. So I'm not talking about something very far in the future that we need so much research to do still. Of course we need research, but most of the building blocks that we need for floating cities are already there. And I just have a couple of them. For instance, floating breakwaters have been developed. Floating LJ biofuel systems that I explained about have been developed already by NASA. Floating roads have been developed already 15 years ago. Floating houses, but also floating hydroponic systems where you have fish cultivation and vegetable cultivation also exist already. So All the building blocks are there, we just need to bring them together and apply them on a larger scale and also on a maritime scale. And we have worked also a little bit on developing some building blocks. So here you see the floating pavilion, it's right here, and we thought, what kind of things can you do here around the floating pavilion? And we're not only talking about real estate, also about parks, public buildings, all sorts of buildings, in a very dynamic way. So this is basically, there's this Dutch game, you might not know it, what's called Kolonisten van Catan. It's a kind of a game where people try to develop a new type of communities. And, well, you could use this in a similar way, in a very dynamic way, constantly adapt your urban area to the changing demands of society. And here are just some examples. For instance, floating office space that we developed, a floating energy island, floating underwater restaurants, art pavilion, all sorts of things that you could do underwater. So how do we see the future? I think at the moment we're still, like here in the floating pavilion Rotterdam, we're still here, basically in protected areas. So we're in ports, we're in sheltered areas with relatively quiet water conditions. I think quite soon we will be able to create floating urban districts in front of the coast. The moment you move in front of the coast, you need to do something against waves. So you either need a breakwater, or you need a wetland, or you need to do something. So you see here, for instance, floating breakwater, but it could also be an artificial reef. There are all sorts of things that you could do. I think another 10 years later, we would be able to have floating cities in the middle of the sea, surrounded with their own system. And then in 2050, we might have floating cities outside the territorial waters with their own, completely their own political independent system. So not part of a nation state. What's very important if you move to large-scale floating structures, that you also can apply modular systems. You can use, with only one or two elements, you can create very much for a large variety of different structures that can be produced in a mass production environment, so you are very efficient. We work together with the Seasteading Institute from California, and their mission is to create floating cities in the middle of the ocean that are completely independent as nation states. So they're independent from our current political systems. We work already for about 5 or 6 years with them, doing design work and consultancy work for them. It's really exciting. One of the projects we're working on now, this is the book. The director of the Seasteading Institute, Joe Quirk, has written this book. I recommend it because it's, I think, the best book to give you an introduction why the world needs floating cities. And it's very nice to read, and he explores different themes such as healthcare, climate change, economic development, all sorts of themes, all related to floating city development. So really interesting. This is the project that we're developing together with the Seasteading Institute in French Polynesia. We're creating a floating island there. And island states such as French Polynesia, they are very much threatened by climate change. It's expected by 2100 the world might see as many as 2 billion climate refugees because of flooding, but also other climate impacts. So it's very important, in particular for the island states, to explore other ideas, other options that might be useful to them if their islands are threatened by climate change. And this is a multifunctional project that we developed together with the Seasteading Institute. This is a top view. And it's basically an international project, but also very much in collaboration with local stakeholders and local citizens and designers. And as you can see, what we try to do is also to have a really economic, to also let it fit into the landscape. So to really make a design that's also part of the natural environment and not stands out too much. So it should be in harmony. Ecological impacts, very important. Multiple ways that we are working on that, minimizing permanent shadows, creating new habitats here next to the building, increasing environmental awareness. If people can see the environment and see the ecology, their awareness can also increase. It can be part of education programs. We try to minimize light at night and also do a lot of monitoring and research, preferably with the underwater drones, but also I think with permanent sensors that are continuously installed in this floating island project. What's very important in my philosophy is that I see urban development as something that could also contribute to nature. That's not so logic. Often you see the opposite. Urban development damages nature. But if we do it the right way, floating urban development could also improve nature. This is a project that we did for the Bay of San Francisco, where you see, we call it the shifting green frontier. This floating project here creates quiet water conditions here where we can have sedimentation of soil particles and growing new wetlands. So after a couple of years, the floating zone moves out, more and more creating the wetland behind it. And that's just an example. We have some other examples here. You see some more examples where we try to establish a symbiosis and harmony between people and nature. And this would then be the dream, to live again in harmony with nature in a very nice water environment. Important in that respect is that to not only design the building above the water, but also design the building underwater. Even this building, it's completely flat at the bottom side of the pavilion, but even there's a lot of ecology. Shrimps, we have seen with underwater drones, seaweed, all sorts of small fish that are under this building right now, probably. But imagine what happens if you can also design the building underwater with all sorts of ecological structures, have mooring systems with hollow 3D printed structures that might function as fish shelter. You can even increase the ecological potential a lot. And I think that's very important if we need to accommodate 3.5 billion citizens. Additionally, in cities, we need to do it the right way. We've done a very large study together with Floris on the impacts of floating urban development on the water quality, together with a lot of partners. And here you see some of the things that we have seen under these floating buildings. And for instance, this is really interesting. All sorts of shellfish are attached at the underside of these floating platforms, and they treat the water, they improve the water quality, but they also provide ecological value. And you see also that the small fish, they like very much to shelter under these floating platforms because it's a hiding place for them. So by doing that, we can provide buildings, but also ecological value. And I think the combination of that makes it a really strong concept. People ask me, yeah, it's only for very rich people because the pavilion is very expensive, and also the project in the Arnhemspolder that you did. And well, not necessarily. We also did research together with Rick on affordable floating housing. And you can also provide affordable floating housing. We did research on this for the Philippines, and it appeared to be really much possible to also create affordable housing. So it's not necessarily very, very expensive. In general, making something on the water is more expensive than on the land, but usually the water is much cheaper than the land. So at the end of the day, your business case is usually quite competitive. Other things we're working on, floating solar, together with TU Delft. Of course, we need to have a lot of renewable energy. The water provides space also to create floating solar energy. Maybe also in combination with breakwaters for wave reduction. Other research projects we're working on, I already talked about the ecological impact, but also modular utilities and platforms. We're involved in a really large Horizon 2020 project supported by the European Commission, where we explore together with Marin and Wageningen, you see a test here, we evaluate what is the impact of waves on floating platforms. And can these floating platforms support large-scale urban development? In the North Sea, very challenging because the North Sea is one of the most rough wave conditions of all the seas in the world. So we start at the most difficult level immediately. So if we can do it there, we can make floating cities everywhere. The North Sea, this is the coastline. This is a project we did for the top sector water. Where you see this is Rotterdam here, Amsterdam here, where we make a hyperloop connection with a floating city here. Solar power, wind power, but also LJ farms are part of that. Building with nature, new islands, artificial reefs. But what's very important that we use the CO2 of IJmuiden and also Rotterdam. We use the CO2 and the heat in a productive way in these floating aquaculture systems. So it's also part of the circular economy. This is our future vision for the Netherlands. It's basically the translation of the Blue Revolution to the North Sea. Thank you very much.